Arizona Territory. Spring of 1877, the sun had just begun to bleed over the edge of the Dragoon Mountains when she tried to steal his horse. Pearl Harrove had dirt in her boots, blood on her sleeve, and nothing left to lose. She had not slept in 2 nights, had not eaten since the day before, and her feet were blistered raw from walking canyon after canyon trying to avoid the lawmen she was sure were chasing her. She did not think, only moved. The chestnut gelding was tied loosely to a post outside a weather-beaten trading shack just east of Tombstone. Saddle still on, water bucket nearby. She reached for the reins like a woman reaching for salvation. "You planning on stealing my horse?" a warm voice said. "Or just borrowing him for a while?" Pearl froze, her hand on the bridle, eyes snapping up to meet the stranger's. He was leaning against the corner of the building, arms crossed, a tin mug in one hand. Tall, dusty, tan skin, sun-browned. He looked like he had seen his share of hard days and knew how to survive them. His dark green eyes were steady, unreadable, but not unkind. Pearl's heart thudded. She stepped back from the horse, jaw clenched. "I am not looking to cause trouble," she said. He tilted his head. "You already did the moment you touched my horse." She looked over her shoulder. The trail behind her was empty, but she did not trust it. Her voice came out low and desperate. "I just need to ride." The man took a long sip from his mug, then looked her over again. "Where to?" "Anywhere that ain't here." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he straightened and walked toward her, slow and calm, like one would approach a skittish animal. When he reached the horse, he scratched behind the gelding's ears. Then he said, "Take it if you will let me ride beside you." Pearl blinked. "What? You heard me." He set the mug down on a crate. "You look like you're running from something. I am not asking what, but I have my own reasons for heading east. I could use the company." "You can have the horse, but I am coming with you." She hesitated. "You do not even know me," he shrugged. "Then tell me your name while we ride." She stared at him, breath catching. No one had looked at her without suspicion in months. No one had offered anything without trying to take more. She was waiting for the catch, but it did not come. "Pearl," she said finally. "Pearl Harrove." He nodded once. "Perrin Hayes. Saddle up, Pearl." They rode out by sunrise, the air still cool, the desert quiet except for the steady clop of hooves and the rustling wind. Pearl kept glancing at him from the corner of her eye. Perrin rode like a man who had done it all his life, loose in the saddle, hand resting easy near his holster, gaze always scanning the horizon. They did not talk much that day. They camped beneath a bluff by a dry creek bed. Perrin built the fire. Pearl sat quiet, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames. When he handed her a tin cup of beans, she took it like it might vanish. "You got folks?" he asked, voice gentle. She shook her head. "Not anymore," he nodded, not pressing. She glanced at him. "You?" "I had a wife once," he said simply. "She died 5 years back, no children." Pearl let the silence stretch long between them. The fire crackled. Coyotes yipped in the distance. "I had 2 younger brothers," she said at last. "One died in Missouri, the other, I do not know. I left him behind." Perrin studied her, his face unreadable. "You want to find him?" "I want to keep him safe," she said. "And I can't do that if I am caught." They rose early the next morning, riding through dry washes and over rocky ridges. Pearl started to relax, just slightly, with every mile that passed. Perrin never asked questions she was not ready to answer. She caught him watching her sometimes, quiet and thoughtful, but never judging. 2 days later, they reached a small ranch town tucked against the foothills. Perrin stopped before the general store. "I need to get a few things," he said. "You should eat something proper." "I do not have money." "I do." His voice was firm. "You are riding with me, I will feed you." It made her uncomfortable, but she followed him in. He bought bread, jerky, dried apples, and a clean shirt for her. She refused the shirt, but he bought it anyway. Outside, she muttered, "You do not have to take care of me." He looked at her then, steady and calm. "Maybe not, but I want to." Something shifted in her chest. She looked down at the food in her hands. "Thank you." They camped that night under a stand of cottonwoods. Pearl changed into the clean shirt behind a boulder, then sat by the fire, shoulders not quite so tight. Perrin handed her a coffee tin, then sat beside her. "Where are you really going, Pearl?" "I do not know yet," she said. "Just away," he nodded. "Then I will ride with you until you figure it out." She looked at him. "Why?" Perrin met her eyes. "Because I like who you are when you do not have to run." Pearl did not know what to say to that. They rode for 5 more days, avoiding towns, sleeping under stars. They spoke more often now. She told him about growing up in Kansas, about her mama's stubborn streak, and how she used to sing while cooking. He told her about working cattle drives in Texas, about his wife's laugh, about rebuilding after loss. Pearl started smiling again. At first, it felt strange on her face, but Perrin's dry humor and quiet strength made it easy. He never pushed, never asked for more than she could give. But his presence was steady beside her, like the sun rising behind her shoulder. On the 9th night, while the fire cracked low, Pearl looked across at him and said, "I do not want to keep running." Perrin's eyes met hers. "Then let us stop," she swallowed. "I am scared." "I know," he said. "But I will not let anything happen to you. You ride with me, Pearl, all the way." She crossed the space between them, sat beside him, let her shoulder brush his. The firelight flickered across his face. He turned to her, and for a long moment they just looked. "Thank you," she whispered. He leaned in, slow and sure. "You saved yourself, Pearl. I am just here to ride beside you." And when his lips found hers, soft and certain, the desert wind stilled. Pearl had not trusted anyone in years. But in that kiss, she felt something solid. Something that did not ask, just gave. Something she had not dared hope for. Home. The wind kicked up dust along the low bend of the arroyo, and the horses shifted, tails flicking at gnats. Perrin had just finished oiling his saddle when he turned and caught Pearl staring at the mountains to the north. Her face was unreadable, set in that quiet way she had when her thoughts pulled too far inward. He stood, brushing his palms on his trousers. "You got a mind to change direction." Pearl didn't look over. "I remember someone saying there's mining work in Prescott. Someplace where a woman can disappear if she's careful." "There is," he said, "but it's a rough sort of place." I didn't ask if it was easy. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, filled with the snap of horse tack and the dry rustle of mesquite. "I know a man up that way," he said at last. "Union veteran, keeps a boarding house with his sister. They don't ask questions unless you bring trouble to their door. We'd have to cut west across the Hassayampa." She turned to him then. "You trust them?" "I do." Pearl nodded once. "Then that's where we go." They broke camp before full light, riding west through thorn brush and sun-baked creeks trickling with spring runoff. The land sloped higher with every mile, the air tinged now with pine and rock dust instead of sand. By the time the sun hung high, they'd reached a shaded glen where the grass grew long and sweet. Perrin dismounted and led his horse to drink from the narrow stream, then glanced over his shoulder. "Take your boots off," he said. "Let your feet breathe. You can't ride steady if you're limping." Pearl hesitated, then sat on a flat stone and tugged them free. Her socks were thin and threadbare, her toes red around the edges. She didn't wince, but he saw the way she curled her foot once it was bare. "You've been walking too far on too little," he said. "I had to." "I know." He handed her a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt. "Wrap that around the worst one. It'll hold till we reach the high pass." She took it without protest, but her hands trembled slightly as she wound the cloth around her heel. "Where'd you learn to patch up like this?" she asked. Army surgeon taught me a few things, he said, crouching nearby. Back when I didn't know one end of a rifle from the other, you fought for a while. He picked up a dried pine cone, turned it over in his hand. Lost my stomach for it after Shiloh. Pearl didn't speak, but something in her face softened. She set her boot aside and looked toward the tree line. Those two men back in Tucson, they were following me, she said, voice low. One of them knew my brother. I think they meant to use me to get to him. Do they know where he is? I don't think so. She pulled her knees up to her chest. I left a trail they'll have trouble following. He tossed the pine cone aside. You want to send word to him once you're settled, if I can find someone I trust. Her eyes flicked to his. Maybe it'll be you. He didn't smile, but something shifted behind his eyes. They rode into the hills that evening, the air turning sharp as the sun dipped. The path narrowed, forcing them single file. Pearl rode ahead now, her back straight, her hair tied in a bandana to keep the grit out. Perrin kept watch behind, one hand near his rifle. Coyotes howled somewhere to the south, and a hawk circled high overhead. At the top of the ridge, Pearl halted. Below them, the valley held a patchwork of trees and glinting water, a bend of the Hassayampa curling like ribbon through the brush. She shaded her eyes. Never thought I'd see green again. He pulled up beside her. It's short-lived. These hills dry out come summer, but it's something for now. She looked over at him, and this time her face was open. You keep saying things like that for now, until like you don't plan to stay anywhere long. I don't, he said. Not usually. But you're still riding with me. He met her gaze. You asked me to. No, you offered. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. That's true. She turned back toward the valley. I don't know what it means yet, you being here, but I think I want to find out. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, You'll have time, Pearl. I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. They camped near a grove of juniper that night, the stars sharp overhead. Pearl lay wrapped in her blanket, staring at the sky. Perrin sat close, whittling something from a stick, a habit more than a purpose. After a long while, she said, I used to be good with a needle. Could mend shirts near invisible. He looked over. Still got the knack, not sure, but I think I'd like to try again. That boarding house has a sewing table near the kitchen window, he said. Plenty of light in the mornings. She turned her head toward him. You think they'd let me work there? I think they'd be glad to have you. She was quiet for a beat. I've never had anything of my own. Not really. You could. Pearl looked at him then, eyes searching his face in the firelight like she was trying to decide if he meant it. He didn't look away. After a moment, she shifted closer, her blanket brushing his arm. She didn't say anything more, and neither did he. But when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he let the knife rest and held still, letting the moment settle like dust after a long ride. They sat like that until the fire burned low. The road into Prescott curled through pine and shale, passing abandoned diggings and cabins half swallowed by the slope. By late morning, Pearl's shoulders ached from the ride, but she didn't complain. The high air carried the scent of wet bark and iron-rich soil, and Perrin had fallen quiet beside her, gaze fixed on the trees like he was reading something she couldn't see. They reached a bluff above the town just as a wagon creaked past below, loaded with sacks of barley and a boy riding barefoot on top, his legs swinging. Pearl watched him disappear between rooftops, then turned toward Perrin. That your friend's place? He pointed toward a 2-story building near the edge of town. That's it. They keep to themselves. You'll get a fair welcome. Pearl nodded and nudged her horse forward. The slope was steep and the gelding took it slow. When they reached the gate, a woman in her 40s came out onto the porch, a broom in hand. She had a face lined by sun and time, but her eyes were sharp behind wire spectacles. "You bring trouble with you, Perrin Hayes," she called, brushing dust from the steps. "No, ma'am," he said, dismounting. "Just someone looking for a quiet corner." The woman looked Pearl over once, then stepped aside. "Then come in. You can leave your saddle out back." Inside, the house smelled of yeast and cedar. Pearl stood just inside the threshold, unsure. The walls were papered in faded floral print, and a rag rug covered the worn floorboards. Perrin set their saddlebags down, then turned toward her. "Her name's Pearl," he said to the woman. "She'll need a room if one's free." "We've got the one over the kitchen," the woman said. "It's warm in the mornings. You eat what we cook and you pull your weight." Pearl met her gaze. "I can sew, and I'm good with ledgers." The woman's brow lifted. "You know figures. My mother kept a store," Pearl said. "She taught me to run it." "Well then," the woman said, turning. "Come help me fix supper. You can tell me more while you peel carrots." That night, Pearl slept in a real bed for the first time in months. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the walls creaked when the wind shifted, but she lay there long after the fire died downstairs, eyes open in the dark, listening to the sounds of a house alive with ordinary life. Somewhere below, a clock ticked steady. She hadn't realized until then how much she'd needed the stillness. In the morning, she found Perrin outside splitting kindling near the woodpile. His sleeves were rolled up, his shirt damp at the collar. She leaned against the fence and watched him for a beat before speaking. "You always work this early." "Only when I want breakfast." He paused, then offered her the axe. "You ever cut wood?" "No," she said, stepping closer. "But I'm willing to learn." He guided her hands onto the handle, his voice low and sure behind her. "Hold steady, don't swing wild. Let the weight do the work." She brought the axe down, missed the center, and the log tipped sideways. She laughed, breathless. "That bad?" "You'll get it," he said. "Try again." By the fifth strike, the log split clean. She straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt, and looked over at him. "You're patient." "I've needed patience," he said. "Some things don't come quick." They rode out later that day to the edge of town, where a neighbor had lost his fence to a rock slide. Perrin helped him haul new rails, and Pearl offered to write out a supply list when the man's wife confessed she couldn't read well enough to order from the catalog. As they walked back, Pearl glanced up the hill. "Feels different being useful again." "You were always useful," Perrin said. "You just didn't have a place to show it." They stopped by the creek where the horses drank. Pearl sat on the bank, pulling wild grass between her fingers. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I was engaged once," she said. "Back before I ran." Perrin crouched nearby, resting his arms on his knees. "He was kind," Pearl went on, "but he didn't see me, not really, just what I could be for him." He didn't interrupt. "I think I started running before I even left," she said. "It just took me getting chased to realize it." Perrin picked up a stone and skimmed it across the water. "You're not running now." "No," she said. "I'm not." The sun dipped low, casting gold across the water. Pearl stood and brushed her skirt free of dust. Perrin rose beside her, close but not pressing. After a moment, she reached for his hand. "I don't need saving," she said. "I know," he replied, linking his fingers with hers. They walked back in silence, horses trailing behind them, the town lights flickering like fireflies in the early dusk. Neither spoke of what came next. They didn't need to. They had already begun it. The monsoon rains came early that year. Perrin stood beneath the overhang of the barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching the downpour flatten the dust into dark, slick earth. Pearl was inside the kitchen, her voice faint and steady as she read inventory aloud to Mrs. Dorsey, the boarding house matron. She'd taken to the ledgers like a river finds its banks, with a quiet surety that settled deeper by the day. A crack of thunder rolled through the hills. Perrin reached up to tighten the rope securing the feed tarp. When he turned, Pearl was stepping across the yard with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, hair pinned off her neck in a loose coil. "Mrs. Dorsey says we're near out of flour," she said as she reached him. "She wants to send for more before the road washes out clear to Skull Valley." "There's a freight wagon heading east tomorrow," he said. "I can ride out and leave word." Pearl shook her head. "Let me go. I've been behind that desk too long already." Perrin's brow furrowed. "You sure?" "I've seen worse weather," she said, brushing rain from her sleeve. "Besides, I need the ride." He didn't argue. They saddled up the gelding and a sturdy bay from the neighbor's stable. Pearl mounted without hesitation, skirts hitched up just enough to keep clear of the stirrups. He rode beside her as far as the fork in the road, where the trail narrowed between cottonwoods. "I'll be back by supper," she said, adjusting her collar. "Ride slow on the downhill," he said. "That red clay turns slick fast." She nodded, and for a moment neither moved. Then she leaned down and pressed her lips to his cheek, brief but deliberate. "I'll be careful," she said. He watched her go until the trees swallowed her up. The hours passed heavy with damp air and the hush that follows a storm. Perrin fixed a latch on the chicken coop, then helped Mr. Dorsey reinforced the barn roof with scrap tin. Rain misted again by late afternoon, and the scent of wet timber hung thick in the yard. Just past dusk, hooves clattered on the path. Perrin stepped out to meet her, lantern raised. Pearl swung down lightly, her braid trailing rainwater against her back. "Got the order in," she said, handing him a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "And a letter from the mill owner. Seems they're short on barley too." "You all right?" he asked, searching her face. "Stopped at the creek bed to let the horse drink," she said. "Had to argue with a trapper who thought I was someone else." He stilled. "What'd he say?" Called me Claire and asked if I'd changed my mind about Colorado. I told him I wasn't interested in anything he was selling. She handed him the reins. He backed off. "You think he was dangerous?" "I think he was drunk and seeing what he wanted." Perrin nodded once. "Still, next time I go with you." She didn't argue. Instead, she reached for his free hand and wrapped both of hers around it. "I'm not used to being looked after," she said. "Still learning how to let it in." "You're not being looked after," he said, voice low. "You're being stood beside." Later that night, after supper was cleared and the house had quieted, they sat outside on the back steps. A blanket settled over their knees. Moths fluttered near the lantern. Pearl traced the rim of her teacup with one finger. "I found a flyer at the post," she said. "Dressmaker's shop is looking for help. They want someone who knows how to draft patterns. You thinking of applying?" "I'm thinking I want to make something that lasts longer than a season," she said. "Something with my name stitched inside." He watched her, the way the firelight played against her cheekbone, the calm in her posture that hadn't been there weeks ago. "I can fix up the empty shed behind the house," he said. "Add a stove, proper windows, you could sew there." She blinked. "You do that. I've got hands and time, and I like seeing you build something." She leaned against him, her shoulder warm against his. "I never had anyone offer me a future before." "You've got one now," he said. "And I'd like to be in it if you'll have me." She turned to face him, eyes steady. "You already are." He kissed her then, slow and certain, no distance left between them. The rain had stopped, but the scent of it clung to the air. Behind them, the house creaked in the wind, a sound not of wear, but of living. They stayed like that until the lamp burned low, and the night folded around them soft as flannel. By late July, the air in Prescott turned sweet with pine sap and warm stone, the kind of heat that settled into the bones but didn't press too hard. Pearl sat at the work table Perrin had built from salvaged floorboards, tracing a sleeve pattern onto brown paper with a steady hand. The little shed behind the boarding house still smelled faintly of linseed oil from the windows he'd sealed last week, but now the space belonged to her. A bolt of pale muslin lay folded beside the scissors. Chalk dust clung to her fingers. Outside, Perrin's voice drifted through the open window, low and even as he bartered with the blacksmith's daughter over a wheel rim. She could hear the smile in his tone, not wide but warm. He'd taken to fixing things for neighbors while she sewed, never asking payment unless someone insisted. A small life, but one they both had chosen. When the hammering stopped, she stepped outside, brushing her hands on her apron. Perrin stood wiping his palms on a rag, sleeves rolled, dust on his boots and neck. "You've got a visitor," he said, nodding toward the front path. A boy stood near the gate, hat in hand, barely more than 15. His shirt was too big and his hair had been cut by someone in a hurry. Pearl's heart slowed. "Name's Emery," the boy said when she reached him. "Said to find a woman called Pearl Harrove. That she had a brother once named Cow." She didn't speak right away. Then she said, "Where did you see him?" "He passed through Skull Valley last month. Rode in with a pack outfit. One of the men said he was looking for work in the Copper Hills. Thought he might head north." Pearl's throat tightened. "Was he well?" "Looked it. Said to give you this if I found you." The boy handed her a folded slip of paper, torn at the edge. It was no more than a few lines, scrawled in a hand she hadn't seen in 2 years. Her eyes scanned it, mouth parted just slightly. "He's alive," she breathed. Perrin stepped beside her. She handed him the note without speaking. He read it, then returned it to her hand. "You want to go find him?" he asked. She shook her head. "He's safer where he is, but I'll send word. Let him know I'm all right." Perrin nodded, quiet. The boy hesitated. "You need anything sent back?" Pearl reached into her apron and drew out the small tin box where she kept the patchwork of her mother's sewing bits of calico, one button with a rose carved on it. She removed a square of blue gingham and folded it carefully. "Tell him I've started over," she said, "and that it's not just me now." The boy tipped his hat. "I can do that." Then he turned and disappeared down the lane. Later that evening, Pearl sat beneath the elm behind the house, a basket of mending in her lap. Perrin joined her with a tin cup of cider, his shirt damp from the pump. "I've been thinking," she said. "If I take on 2 more clients, I can afford to rent the corner room at the Mercantile. Turn it into a shop. I'll help you move your things," he said. She looked up. "I mean to keep doing this, Perrin, not just the sewing, the life." He set the cup down and knelt beside her, one hand warm beside hers on the basket edge. "So do I." She studied his face, then reached for his hand. "I want you with me, not just near, but in it." He leaned in then, not urgently, but with the kind of certainty that came from knowing what mattered. Their lips met, and the sun slipped lower behind the hills. When he drew back, he said, "I'll build you a porch and a sign for the door." She smiled against his shoulder. "I'll make you a shirt that fits." That fall, they married beneath the cottonwoods that lined the edge of town. The preacher's wife scattered wildflowers along the path, and Mrs. Dorsey hemmed Pearl's dress with quiet hands. There were no grand speeches, no music, but when Perrin took Pearl's hand and said her name, there was something in it that held more promise than vows ever could. They moved into a small house near the ridge, not far from the shop Pearl opened with her name painted in clean black letters on the window. She took in work from ranchers' wives and schoolteachers, stitching dresses with care and remembering every child's name who waited beside their mothers. Perrin built furniture for the neighbors and fixed tools for the livery. He never charged more than he needed, and always brought home wild honey when he found it. In the evenings, they sat on the porch he built, her feet tucked beneath her skirt, his arm resting behind her on the bench. Sometimes they talked of the road behind them, But more often they spoke of the one ahead of the garden they'd plant in spring, of the fence he'd build with cedar rails, of the quiet joy in knowing exactly where they belonged. And one morning, as the frost melted from the sill and Pearl stood brushing flour from her hands, she turned to him with a look that said more than words ever could. He crossed the room, wrapped his arms around her, and held her there, steady as he'd always been. In the years that followed, they built a life from small, steady things: a quilt that warmed their bed, a row of herbs on the windowsill, a home full of mornings and meals and soft laughter. They never hurried. They never turned back. And when strangers passed through town and asked about the sewing shop with the white porch and the man who always offered water to the horses, the townsfolk only smiled. "That's the Hargrove place," they'd say. "She built it with her hands, he built it with his heart," and both were true.